Thank you, John. Hi, everyone. My name is Payal. I am a PhD candidate in sociology and demography here. Thank you so much to the work department for giving me the opportunity to share my work with you today. I'm excited about this. My talk today is called Stillbirth, a Missing Piece in Population Science. So my work lies at the intersection of demography, the sociology of medicine, the sociology of gender, social inequality, and global studies. Broadly, my research agenda is to improve our understanding of how social inequality along axes like gender, caste, religion, race, ethnicity affect health outcomes. I have a number of projects that investigate the different aspects of the relationship between social disadvantage and health. I'm especially interested, though, in inequalities in health outcomes related to pregnancy. So today I'm going to talk about pregnancy outcome that's hugely consequential to understanding global health and well-being, but that's severely understudied, and that outcome is stillbirth. I came to this topic because before graduate school, I spent several years living in India and working in the rural north of the country. In particular, I spent time at a government hospital and noticed not only that sometimes newborn babies died, but also sometimes babies died during labor, even before they were delivered. So as I began my first year classes in demography, I wondered where these babies were counted in the population health statistics that we're so used to using, like the infant mortality rate and the total fertility rate. And it turns out that they're not. I was surprised to discover that demography, the science of life, death, population movement, pays so little attention to stillbirth. So in my dissertation, I wanted to understand why experiences of pregnancy loss are not accounted for in our standard measures of population health, what the consequences of this are, and how our understanding of the world changes if we do consider pregnancy more seriously. So before I go any further, I just want to clarify what I mean by a stillbirth. According to the WHO, it's a pregnancy loss at 28 weeks or 7 months of gestation or later. In other words, it's a baby that's born dead. So to explain, this diagram starts at the onset of pregnancy, when early losses are called miscarriages and abortions. After 22 weeks, pregnancy losses are called early gestation stillbirth, which are distinct from late gestation stillbirths, or losses that occur after 28 weeks or 7 months of gestation until birth. And stillbirths are also different from a newborn or an infant death, which is the death of a baby born alive, which is after the red line. And a stillbirth is categorized separately because of its viability outside of the womb. And so in this analysis, when I focus on stillbirth, these are the ones that I'm referring to, because in most parts of the world, a baby born at 28 weeks can survive. Stillbirth can have multiple causes, including problems with the placenta or the umbilical cord, genetic conditions with the fetus, infections, or other pregnancy complications. Stillbirth can occur either before labor starts or during the process of delivery. But developmentally, live-born and stillborn babies are virtually indistinguishable and can be separated in age by seconds. Approximately 2 million stillbirths occur annually. This is more than the total number of deaths to children under 5 from diarrhea and pneumonia combined. So one thing to note here is that the rates in this map are based on model rates. It's necessary to do this kind of modeling because although some countries do collect empirical data on stillbirth, such data from most parts of the world is either of poor quality or lacking completely. But what this map is showing is that stillbirths are concentrated in the global south. Over 75% of them occur in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and most of these are preventable. Yet, unlike under 5 and infant mortality, which have received vast attention and investment and have long been the focus of rigorous study and public discourse, stillbirths were not mentioned in the UN's most recent Sustainable Development Goals, even though maternal mortality and newborn mortality were. Stillbirths are also not accounted for in the demographic study of population health. These are just some general graphics showing trends in global mortality and fertility. You can see underlined in red, both consider only births or live births. I'm now going to show some foundational graphs from a classic demography textbook, which many of you have of course seen before. This is a survival curve. On the x-axis are ages, on the y-axis is the proportion of the population surviving. The curve shows the fraction of a population remaining alive at each age. And the thing to notice here is that it starts with the line of live birth. And on the right is a Lexis diagram showing the lifelines of 8 women. On the x-axis are years, and on the y-axis are the women's ages. So each of the diagonal lines represents a woman, and the dots that the arrows are pointing to are the children that those women gave birth to. This graph is showing how old the women were when they had children, and the points down at the bottom are the beginnings of those children's lifelines. And the thing to notice on this graph is that there are only dots for the women's children who were born alive. It's perplexing that a live-born baby who takes a few breaths and then dies is counted as a death in our mortality statistics, but a stillborn baby who dies at the end of pregnancy or during labor is not counted as a death at all, despite the similarities between newborn and stillborn babies. It's also perplexing that even though women who experience a stillbirth have sustained at least 7 full months of pregnancy, the costs to their bodies are not accounted for in traditional measures of fertility, which only count the number of live babies born. Traditional demographic measures of mortality and fertility begin with live birth, as if there's no other way for a pregnancy to end. This is the way that it's always been, and all of our measures and enumerators and denominators that go into them are built upon this assumption of live birth being an important line in the sand. So there's two things going on here. In addition to being poorly measured, like I showed earlier, stillbirths are also conceptually not included in our measures of mortality and fertility. But it's surprising that demographers don't study stillbirth because it's informative about mortality. It's informative about fertility. It's also informative about reproduction, gender inequality, and the workings of local and global health systems. How is it possible that the science whose object is life and death and whose primary aim is to describe population processes ignores stillbirth altogether? This neglect is partly a reflection of the fact that stillbirth prevalence is low in the global north, and partly a reflection of the devaluation of women's experiences, particularly in the global south, where most of the world's stillbirths occur. Although it's not measured as part of any demographic process, experiencing a stillbirth is hugely consequential for families and the women themselves, and so this is an issue that matters greatly to people's lives. It also matters for public policy and for social science more broadly because examining stillbirth affects the core of population science, shifting what we think we know about mortality and what we think we know about fertility. So what I want to demonstrate today is that there's this phenomenon that's existed in plain sight all along, yet it's been overlooked. And paying attention to stillbirth opens up numerous questions that have remained unasked in social science. And so this will be the focus of my talk today, in which I'll argue that recognizing and counting stillbirth expands and transforms our understanding of women's health and population health more broadly. Understanding the causes and consequences of the global failure to measure stillbirth well can offer a way forward in improving measurement of pregnancy and pregnancy loss and can make marginalized experiences more visible. So here's what the rest of the talk will look like. First, I'll describe the literature that this work draws from. Next, I'll talk about the data that I use. For my quantitative analyses, I'll use secondary data from the Demographic and Health Survey, or the DHS, which I'll describe in detail up front. For qualitative analyses, I use interview data that I collected through fieldwork in India. I'll discuss the interview data later in more detail, but I want to just acknowledge that I will be telling some stories later in the talk that might be upsetting to hear in case anyone needs to step out. And then I'll talk about my innovations and findings. I'm going to provide a few different lenses on stillbirth in my talk today to show what was missed by not paying attention to it and to show what we can now gain from more carefully studying this unrecognized but important category. For today, I aim to show how paying attention to stillbirth is like discovering the missing piece of a puzzle. It was always there in plain sight, but once placed, it brings the entire picture into better focus. From a mortality perspective, I calculate new measures of child mortality that include stillbirth. These new measures reveal a significant shift in the scale of global mortality, expose greater disparities between countries than traditional statistics, and potentially complicate the narrative of universal child mortality improvement globally. From a fertility perspective, I quantify the overlooked burden of pregnancy and pregnancy loss and propose a new measure, updating the total fertility rate to account for the reproductive labor of pregnancy and recognize the costs of reproduction. These new quantitative measures uncover dimensions of population health that were previously unseen. I then turn to my qualitative findings. Through over 100 in-depth interviews in India, I find a logic to stillbirth's poor measurement and demonstrate the real and significant impact of stillbirth on people's lives. I show that in a world in which only the things that are measured exist, better measurement is foundational to fully recognizing this burden. Sociologists and demographers are well positioned to lead the charge in reimagining the study of mortality and fertility that takes seriously what paying attention to stillbirth can teach us. Today, I'll show how doing so reveals a new and important dimension of population health and provides a more complete assessment of the health of society. More broadly, this talk invites us to critically examine the global north assumptions that we take for granted and to strive to be aware of the things we've grown accustomed to overlooking. My work builds from the work of demographers, sociologists, anthropologists, and bioethicists thinking about pregnancy, loss, and reproductive labor. Although some early demographers have considered pregnancy loss in calculating projections of women's fertility, it's often assumed to have little variation across populations and difficult to study because of measurement issues. Stillbirth has generally been considered uncommon and therefore unimportant in foundational literature. But other scholars have pushed for a greater centering of women's experiences and perspectives in science. Specific to pregnancy, an important body of work recognizes the often invisible reproductive labor involved in pregnancy. This work emphasizes the physical, emotional, and social work that sustains society, but is rarely acknowledged in mainstream discourse. With respect to demography specifically, more recently, a growing body of evidence demonstrates that studying the dynamics of survival among non-population members and their selection into live birth is crucial to the scientific understanding of population health. Another line of scholarly research seeks to see loss in ways that are different from traditional demographic rates. Some scholars view loss not just as an individual event, but as one that's shaped by local and global structures of power. Others flip the focus to focus on the people who experience the deaths of others. These alternative perspectives build on the work of scholars who examine the foundations of knowledge itself. I extend these literatures to focus on how centering women's perspectives and experiences, and including stillbirth, changes our understanding of population health. Before I show any results, I will talk a little bit about the quantitative secondary data that I'm able to use. Another reason that stillbirth has been neglected in demographic research is because of how difficult it is to measure. This is not a reason not to study it, but it's important to be clear about its strengths and weaknesses. So as demographers, we're used to trying to make sense of the limited data that exists and understand its biases. So for the analyses that I'm going to show you today, which focus on the Global South, I use data from the Demographic and Health Survey, the DHS. The DHS is a population representative sample survey. It uses a standardized questionnaire across 92 countries since 1989. Data on mortality comes from a birth questionnaire, where women are asked about every live birth that they've ever had, if and when those babies died, how old their children were at the time of death, and so on. I use these questions to count neonatal and infant deaths. While the DHS does not record the number or type of pregnancy losses a woman has ever had, it does collect a reproductive calendar, which charts key reproductive records for women for the 5 years prior to the start of the survey. This was largely designed to understand contraceptive use, but I use it to count reported pregnancies and stillbirths and the duration of each pregnancy. So this is what the reproductive calendar looks like. It's read from right to left in chronological time, with each character representing a month in a woman's reproductive history. Stillbirths are T's, a termination, with 6 or more P's, a month of pregnancy in front of them. So this is a live birth at 9 months. This is a pregnancy loss at 3 months, a pregnancy loss at 6 months, and a stillbirth at 9 months. There are black and blue boxes here because they show what we're used to paying attention to and what we're not. The black boxes show the experiences that traditional rates of mortality and fertility capture, and all of the blue boxes show women's experiences of pregnancy and pregnancy loss that traditional statistics don't capture. And I'll come back to this later. So which way does the poor measurement of stillbirth go? There are many reasons to think that stillbirth is underestimated. Scholars have shown that in many places, women face blame and stigma in the event of a stillbirth, which may lead them to not reporting one. Questionnaires also are not usually designed to capture stillbirth, like the reproductive calendar that I just showed. And most compellingly, in studies that compare expected patterns of stillbirth rates with other types of early life deaths, stillbirths are clearly being undermeasured. Still, it's important to keep in mind that it is possible that stillbirths are sometimes also overcounted if newborn deaths are being reported as stillbirths. This may happen if careful assessment of the baby was not done or if it's difficult to distinguish what happened. So even though this data is imperfect, there is still much to be learned from thinking carefully about stillbirth and pregnancy loss as they relate to our measures of population health. Sorry. Okay, so what does paying attention to stillbirth tell us about mortality? Traditional rates of child mortality are calculated with only live births in the denominator. This means that only babies that are born alive are considered eligible to die. But we know that many of the same factors cause death right before the line of live birth and right after the line of live birth. And we know that there are sometimes issues with misclassification. So this analysis shifts the denominator back to 28 weeks of gestation to address head-on the paradox I mentioned earlier. Why would a baby that takes one breath and then dies be counted, but not one that died during the process of labor? I'll also just say that I am drawing this line at 28 weeks, but it can also be taken further back. Stillbirth is actually defined at earlier gestation in many places, but the further back we go, places get less comparable and the measurement challenges are just intensified. And so for the purposes of this analysis, I'm going to stick with 28 weeks. In practice, what I'm doing is this. This is how infant mortality and the neonatal mortality rate are traditionally calculated. The numerator includes deaths up to 1 year or 28 days. The denominator includes live births that occurred over the same period. My innovation is that I'm adding stillbirths to both the numerator and the denominator of traditional measures. These new measures of fetal, neonatal, and infant mortality allow us to see stillbirths, neonatal deaths, and infant deaths as having the same starting point in terms of exposure to the risk of death starting at 7 months of gestation. In other words, a fetus surviving up to the 7th month of pregnancy is then exposed to the risk of stillbirth and of subsequent neonatal or infant death before reaching the end of the 1st month or year of life. These new measures allow us to understand the magnitude of how much more mortality exists when stillbirths are included in traditional neonatal and infant mortality rates. To give a concrete example, this is where we left off in the previous slide, just taking infant mortality for the moment. Let's say we have 1,000 live births in a period and 100 of them die in the 1st year of life. This means that 10% of those exposed to the risk of death died. If we use these new indicators that I'm proposing, and let's say that in addition to the 100 infant deaths, there were also 50 stillbirths, we would add those stillbirths into both the numerator and the denominator. So at the same level of traditional infant mortality, when we add in 50 stillbirths, 14.3% of those exposed to the risk of death died. And as the number of stillbirths increases, this fraction increases. Now, this is just a toy example because stillbirth and infant deaths may move together, but the point is that paying attention to stillbirths lets us see losses that we weren't seeing before. So this graph shows the rate of traditional infant mortality in blue. Again, that's deaths in the 1st year of life, per 1,000 live births on the x-axis. I've done this for various world regions, but just so that it's easy to see what's going on, I'm only showing countries in sub-Saharan Africa from 2015 and on here. This graph adds in stillbirths to make the updated measures I'm proposing, the fetal infant mortality rate. The rate of traditional infant mortality is in blue, and the fetal infant mortality rate is in red on the x-axis, and each country year is on the y-axis. In the full analysis, I look across 47 countries, and across all countries, fetal infant mortality rates are between 2.8 and 21.9 deaths per 1,000 births, greater than traditional rates, with an average of 11.5 per 1,000. Across all countries, fetal infant rates are from 10% to 138% higher than traditional rates, with an average of 35% higher. In many countries, this is a substantial increase in the number of deaths experienced in the population. So for example, in Senegal in 2019, which has the lowest rate of infant mortality in this graph, the fetal infant rate reveals an additional 11,000 deaths that the traditional infant mortality does not capture. In more populous countries, the number is even larger. So in Ethiopia, the fetal infant rate recognizes almost 40,000 additional deaths in 2016. And in Nigeria, the fetal infant rate recognizes 126,000 additional deaths in 2018. Globally in 2022, 3.5 million live-born children died in the 1st year of life. Across just the 47 countries in this analysis, this new measure reveals over 1 million additional deaths. Fetal infant mortality rates also reveal greater inequality in well-being than traditional rates of infant mortality. So here we see the 5 countries with the lowest and highest rates of traditional infant mortality on the y-axis and the mortality rate on the x-axis. And here the gap in mortality between the country with the lowest and highest rates is larger when we include stillbirths. An important thing to keep in mind is that we know stillbirth is undermeasured in many places. And so to correct for this, in 2006, the WHO calculated a ratio to estimate stillbirth in places with poor quality data, using better measured rates of early neonatal mortality or deaths that happen in the first 7 days of life. It just says to take that country's rate of death in the first 7 days, called the ENMR, and multiply it by 1.2 because it's expected that there will be more stillbirths than deaths in the first 7 days of life. This graph shows that the scale of infant mortality would shift even further if we use this adjustment. And I'm not endorsing this very crude 1.2 measure, but it shows that adjusting our measures may show us more mortality than we are currently able to see. And then neonatal mortality is also important to pay attention to separately from infant mortality because the UN Sustainable Development Goal targets exist only for neonatal mortality, and because it's increasingly becoming the focus of policy intervention as early life deaths become concentrated earlier in life. As a reminder, neonatal death is a death in the first 28 days of life. So this figure is looking at traditional and fetal neonatal rates over time. Here, rates are on the y-axis and time is on the x-axis. Traditional rates are in blue, fetal neonatal rates are in red, and the new flat black line shows the global neonatal mortality target of 12 deaths per 1,000 live births by 2030. This is showing only sub-Saharan African countries. As we see here, the fetal neonatal rates are, of course, up higher than traditional rates everywhere, but the takeaway is that by considering stillbirths in our conceptualization of child mortality and population health, many countries would be further away from global neonatal mortality targets than they're currently considered to be. This figure demonstrates that reaching global goals will require more resources and effort than existing population health statistics suggest. In most places, trends in fetal neonatal mortality follow trends in traditional neonatal mortality, moving up and down in tandem over time. However, in several countries and across regions, the two measures might diverge in important ways. So here I'm focusing on a few individual countries. Again, the blue lines are traditional rates, the red lines are fetal neonatal rates. In Nepal, the fetal neonatal rate plateaued while the traditional neonatal rate continued a downward trajectory. More dramatically, in Mali, Nigeria, and Bolivia, the fetal neonatal rate increased while the traditional neonatal rate plateaued or decreased. Global health narratives tend to emphasize how much progress has been made in improving child mortality. These results here on this slide are not definitive by any means, but they suggest that this story may not be universally true. Specifically, stillbirth is multi-causal, and there are also multi-causal gaps in measurement. And so stillbirth may not vary in ways that are related to other types of mortality. Accounting for stillbirth pushes us to consider the possibility that things may be getting worse in some places, hindering progress globally. And so to conclude this section, I'll just recap to say that without considering stillbirth as a form of mortality, traditional mortality measures mischaracterize population health challenges. To understand a newborn's death or illness, it's necessary to take into account the circumstances through which the infant's organism passed before birth. Thus, reporting of stillbirth as part of the same measures that report neonatal and infant mortality is a recognition of the deep connection between maternal, fetal, and newborn health. Thinking about maternal well-being takes me to the next way that stillbirth reveals something new about population health. What does paying attention to stillbirth tell us about fertility? Traditional measures and understanding of fertility focuses on and counts only live births, and the main questions asked focus on how many children women will ultimately bear over the course of their lives. But how those children are produced receives almost no attention. In this section, I'm going to zoom out a little bit from stillbirth alone. Another way to think about stillbirth is that it's part of a larger group of pregnancy experiences that don't end in a live birth, that are unrecorded in the way that we talk about fertility. So women's fertility has and continues to be a major concern globally. In the 60s and 70s and 80s, there was much concern that women were having too many babies, particularly women in certain parts of the world. Today, there's growing concern that there are not enough babies being born. This number, 2.1, is what is known as the TFR, or the total fertility rate, generally understood as the number of babies women will have over their reproductive lives. Despite such intense study and discussion about the number of children women will, could, and should have, the neglect of pregnancy and pregnancy loss within population science overlooks the significant costs of women's reproductive labor globally. Even uncomplicated pregnancies are enormous physical undertakings that involve suppression of the immune system, softening of the tissues and the bones and the joints, often intense bouts of exhaustion and nausea. In many places, women put themselves at risk to be pregnant, as pregnancy itself is associated with increased levels of mortality and morbidity, such as damage to the hips and the pelvic floor. Additionally, the consequences of pregnancy loss can be emotionally and physically serious, both for early and late-term losses. Here again, I'm just quickly going to show you the DHS reproductive calendar. The black boxes are live births that we usually think of when we talk about births and fertility. The blue boxes are terminations, so abortions, miscarriages, and stillbirths that we generally don't include in the demographic measurement of fertility. In a sense, the reproductive calendar is letting us see under the hood of what we usually think of as fertility, only live births, to see how much pregnancy time was required to end up with the number of live births that we're used to counting. I want to note that in this analysis, I'm not trying to differentiate between miscarriage, abortion, and stillbirth. The purpose is just to recognize the time, effort, and energy of carrying any kind of a pregnancy, no matter its outcome. So to recognize the full reproductive lives of women, it's important to recognize pregnancy and not just the babies that are produced. To do this, I count out of the 60 person months prior to the survey, the number of person months that women of reproductive age spent being pregnant in both pregnancies that ended in live birth and those that did not. So here, country years are on the y-axis, and the number of months women spent pregnant is on the x-axis. Across countries, women spend between 7.2 to 13.4 months of the previous 60 months pregnant, with an average of 10.4 months. This is a range of 12 to 22%, with an average of 17% of their lives in the 5 years prior to the survey. Here we see that while most of these months are spent on pregnancies that end in live birth, many of these months are also spent on pregnancies that end in some form of loss. Next, in the spirit of reframing demographic indicators from the point of view of those who experience them, I calculate the prevalence of any kind of pregnancy loss among women of reproductive age who report having been pregnant in the 5 years prior to the survey. This is calculated as the number of losses reported in the reproductive calendar in the numerator, divided by the number of women who reported any pregnancy in the 5 years prior to the survey in the denominator. Here, country years are on the y-axis, and the number of women who experienced a pregnancy loss out of those who had a pregnancy is on the x-axis. Women's experience of pregnancy loss is common across the world. Here you can see that the 5-year maternal cumulative prevalence of pregnancy loss ranges from 59 women who experienced any pregnancy loss per 1,000 women who reported a pregnancy in the last 5 years to 550 per 1,000 women, with an average of 155 per 1,000 women experiencing some kind of a pregnancy loss. It's important to note the very wide variation that we see here. Some of it is coming from actual experiences that women have had, but some of this is also coming from measurement error. And I'm hoping in the future to work on figuring out some of these measurement issues going forward.
Is abortion included in Southeastern Azerbaijan, Moldova, Kazakhstan?
All of them are included. I can't differentiate between abortions. Moving beyond the previous 5 years, if we care about a woman's full reproductive career, we need to think again about the total fertility rate, which estimates how many children the average woman is likely to have over her lifetime. But the problem with the TFR is that traditional demography sees and counts fertility only in terms of live birth, leaving out so much of what reproduction entails. So to address this limitation, I calculate a measure parallel to the TFR that accounts for the pregnancy losses that women experience across ages, which I call the total pregnancy rate, or the TPR. Following the methodology of the TFR, which sums up age-specific rates, the TPR shows the average number of pregnancies a woman would experience if she survived through the end of the reproductive years and experienced at each age the period age-specific pregnancy rates. Here on the y-axis are country years. On the x-axis, the TFRs are in gray and the TPRs are in orange. In all countries, again, of course, the TPRs are larger than the TFRs, ranging from 0.15 larger to 2.26 larger on average, or 4% to 115% larger. By considering pregnancy loss, demographic estimates of fertility can be more complete in recognizing pregnancy and in counting women's reproductive labor. This graph shows the same information as the previous graph, but as a ratio, with TPR over TFR on the x-axis, or how much pregnancy loss on top of live birth is required to get to the live-born children that traditional TFR counts. And this makes clear that more pregnancy is required in some places compared to others to get to the TFR that we're used to counting. So to conclude this section, stillbirth leads us to think more broadly about pregnancy and pregnancy loss and women's reproductive labor as a cost of fertility. Again, opening up a new dimension of population health that's so crucial to the understanding of women's health and overall human well-being. So in this final section, I want to address the fact that as I'm showing you how crucial stillbirth is to broadening and making more accurate our understanding of population health, pregnancy and pregnancy loss are known to be difficult to measure. This means that all of the new measures that I've just shown you so far are far smaller than what the true values likely are. The DHS, if it does somehow continue, is actually moving towards a questionnaire in which every pregnancy is asked about, rather than solely relying on the reproductive calendar. But early studies are showing that this new system is also not able to get accurate rates of pregnancy loss. So one way forward in improving measurement is to first understand why this is not measured well. I'm going to turn back to stillbirth specifically here again to gain some traction on this question of why something that's so consequential to the individuals who are experiencing it and so unambiguous as the loss of a viable baby at the end of pregnancy is still so difficult to measure. There's often a specific logic behind this absence. And to learn that logic required me to do in-depth fieldwork, including qualitative interviews and field site observations. So for my dissertation, I spent 7 months in India conducting this fieldwork. I chose India because it's home to the largest number of estimated stillbirths globally each year. And making progress in India is essential to reaching global health goals. I chose to do this study in Uttar Pradesh, India's most populous state, which has very high rates of fertility and mortality. Mortality rates in UP are comparable or even higher than some parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Then I chose 3 districts near the capital that I could reach within a half day that had the highest crude rates of stillbirth. I selected villages randomly within these districts, and within each village went house to house to identify women who had a stillbirth in the previous 5 years. I also visited numerous health workers at the village level and at block and district level health centers with the highest number of deliveries. With 2 research collaborators, I conducted over 100 in-depth interviews with women and families who have experienced stillbirth, health workers at the village level and in labor rooms in government hospitals, block and district level data entry operators and data managers, government officials, and experts of maternal and child health. I also interviewed health providers in private facilities, as well as families who had experienced neonatal deaths and the deaths of older children. So a few things are important to keep in mind about these interviews. First, because of IRB rules that required us to go door to door to identify women, we learned about a lot of different kinds of losses. This ended up taking a lot of time, but it was actually quite helpful in putting into context how people think and talk about stillbirth in relation to other kinds of losses. Second, almost all of the interviews we did with women ended up being with families. So in this society, it's not appropriate for women to talk alone to strangers. And when we tried to make it happen, it made people very uncomfortable and failed quite miserably. Different parts of each story then are told and remembered by different people in the family. And although being with their families slightly constrained some women's voices, we were able to see the tensions in the narratives that helped me understand more about underreporting than I think I otherwise might have. And last, there's certainly limits to any method, interviews included, but it was very clear that many women wanted to share their stories. One woman followed us through her village to make sure that we talked to her, even though her stillbirth was outside of our 5-year window. Another followed us out after her interview was done and asked if she could come home with us because no one had ever asked her about what she had gone through. So I won't spend a ton of time on this, but India is unique because there are several sources of data that do collect and report population level statistics on stillbirth. These graphs here show rates of stillbirth and infant mortality using well-known Indian data sets between 2011 and 2016. These graphs show over time the infant mortality rate on the right and the stillbirth rate on the left. The yellow and black markers are survey data, and the maroon and orange markers are vital registration system and health system data. And the gray are the UN modeled rates. For infant mortality, we see that the estimates follow priors in demographic research, namely that survey data is of higher quality and more accurate than administrative data. For stillbirth, however, we see that the survey data is quite inconsistent. Importantly, the black dots, which are from India's official source of mortality data, a survey, show very low rates of stillbirth, similar to rates in places like Denmark and Sweden. This is a poster that was in a health center that I visited, showing the official rates of stillbirth in the red box for the state and for the country. I show this to highlight how important measurement is in understanding the state of population health and how we know what we know. For the health workers in this facility who are seeing these statistics, and for the policymakers who are using these statistics to determine resource allocation, these very low numbers suggest that there is no problem at all. Stillbirth in India has been solved. But the graphs that I just showed you suggest something very different. Stillbirth is actually quite prevalent. Just because we're not measuring it well, there's no pressure to act to prevent it. So we can think about stillbirth measurement as happening in two places, in health and vital registration system and in surveys. In some sense, given India's very punitive health system, it's not that difficult to understand why health system actors might want to hide that stillbirths are happening. Many people told us explicitly that data manipulation is rampant, and nurses and data entry operators and managers all fear punishment, all fear losing their jobs. So even though stillbirth certificates like this one exist and include lots of important information, they're very rarely used. I spent a lot of time trying to track one down, and I only found two. They barely contain any information about what happened. Because health systems data tend not to be of great quality and are viewed as not being very trustworthy, much of the world's stillbirth data relies on survey data like the DHS. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus on stillbirth measurement in surveys. Much of the mortality measurement literature talks about how women, particularly those with less education or older women, tend to forget the deaths of children over time when they're asked to report them in surveys. This has been said of pregnancy losses also. Many scholars have also written about how issues of stigma, when it comes to reporting pregnancy loss and stillbirth, stigma is also an issue, but this usually is thought about as individual level stigma. Through my interviews, I found underreporting across institutions of the family, the health system, the state, and through experts. This direct underreporting generally affects what shows up in health system and administrative data. My focus in this section of the presentation today is underreporting from women when they're asked in surveys about their experiences of loss. Through my interviews, I found silences around stillbirth across institutions of the family, the health system, and the state. Some of these are visible to women more directly and some more indirectly, but they all reinforce one another and prevent women from openly discussing their experiences of loss. So I didn't find that it was about forgetting or about stigma, but rather that collective social silences shape how women speak aloud about their losses. I'll share Nisha's story, which demonstrates the real and significant impact of stillbirth on people's lives, the incentives within the health system and the state to silence these losses, and the complexity of reporting and understanding stillbirth from surveys when women are asked to report on their own experiences. Nisha is not an individual, but a composite of women who I met and whose stories I encountered in my fieldwork. Nisha felt well during her pregnancy, it was her first, and did not have many checkups, as visiting the health center required her husband to miss work. She received vaccines and had 2 ultrasounds, but avoided iron pills due to their taste. When labor began, her family took her to a community health center, a CHC, where the nurse, concerned about complications, referred her to the district hospital. Worried about the distance and a possible C-section, the family decided to stay at the CHC against medical advice. After a long labor, Nisha delivered a stillborn baby. Worried that Nisha would go into shock, the nurses turned her away so that she would not see the baby's body and told her that the baby was receiving care for breathing issues. Her family confirmed that this was true. The nurses did not record Nisha's admission when she arrived because the labor room was so busy. After the delivery, they chose not to record the birth, fearing the consequences of reporting another stillbirth that month. While Nisha rested, her family buried the baby, but continued to reassure her that the baby was fine. Days later, her sister-in-law revealed the truth, urging Nisha to focus on her recovery and future children. Nisha felt sad that she never got to see her baby, but she kept her grief to herself, finding no space to express her feelings. When surveyors conducting a demographic and health survey interviewed Nisha several months later about her pregnancy history, Nisha did not mention the stillborn baby. She did not feel comfortable saying what had happened aloud in front of the family. So this diagram is now filled in to show that there are silences at multiple levels despite the occurrence of a stillbirth. Silences further arise because there are important tensions between these institutions and within them that create an environment in which obfuscation and silence can thrive. For example, within the family, individuals sometimes disagree on whether a loss was a stillbirth or a newborn death. In addition, because it is custom for women to deliver babies in their natal homes, there's often blame treated about how one family didn't do enough to take care of the woman, her pregnancy, and her baby. Families also often blame village-level health workers for not paying attention enough to the woman or not advocating enough for her at the hospital. In some cases, women and labor room nurses disagree about whether the stillbirth happened before the women reached the hospital or during labor. In terms of data management actors, there's finger pointing in all directions. Those at international organizations say that most of the number fudging is happening at the facility level. Block level folks put the blame on the district level workers, and private doctors put the bulk of the responsibility on public sector medical officers. And finally, experts are unable to show how high the stillbirth numbers seem to be on the ground because of political constraints. These multiple and overlapping tensions in the narratives of stillbirth reveal how women understand and experience stillbirth is not a straightforward or simple question. So to conclude this section, my aim is to illuminate the logic of underreporting. These various absences collectively steer women to minimize or selectively disclose certain aspects of their reproductive experiences. One interesting finding is that one way that women underreport is that they report being behosh or unconscious during childbirth when they're asked about their experience of stillbirth. This suggests a layer of psychological and emotional detachment that may indicate trauma, where women perhaps dissociate from the experience. There's a lot to unpack here, and it'll require further work to understand the various things that might be behind the use of this common idiom, but this claim of unconsciousness itself perhaps reveals a more complicated theory of memory and grief than is understood in traditional demographic thinking. It could be that the demographic model of forgetting over time is not the right way of translating forgetting and memory. What is required for better measurement then is going deeper into what women are feeling and understanding and thinking when asked to report about pregnancy and pregnancy loss. This talk invites us to critically examine the assumptions that we take for granted and the things that we've grown accustomed to overlooking. Stillbirth is in part so poorly measured because it just hasn't received the attention needed to improve its measurement. In a world in which only the things that are measured exist, better measurement is foundational to fully recognizing stillbirth and pregnancy loss more broadly. Without better measurement, patterns of prevalence of health issues in the global north will continue to be applied universally, leading to the neglect of health challenges like stillbirth that are concentrated in the global south. This creates significant gaps in our understanding of population and women's health and perpetuates the marginalization of pressing health challenges within global health priorities. So to conclude, some social scientists might say that the indicators of mortality and fertility I focused on today were not designed to capture pregnancy. I take that point. But the spirit of this research lies in asking, what if we had taken women's perspectives into consideration? Wouldn't this have been included? This framework opens up new questions we can ask and new comparisons that we can make. In terms of global health policy, the poor measurement of stillbirth and pregnancy loss makes visible this important health issue. A lack of high-quality data also leads to an underestimation of disparities. These problems have real consequences for how resources and policy attention are allocated. This work also shows that the choice of what to measure reveals underlying power dynamics. The selection and omission of data not only affect what we think we know, but what is possible to understand. Sometimes things of great social importance can be rendered invisible. The poor measurement of stillbirth and pregnancy loss exposes these limitations and underscores the need for improved methods that make marginalized experiences visible. And finally, the lack of accounting for reproductive labor, including pregnancy and loss, from productivity measures, is precisely what is obscuring their material and emotional dimensions. Recognizing these experiences in social science not only addresses structural gender biases by valuing feminized labor, but also leads to more accurate knowledge of populations in society.
Yes, get some more hands up. Yeah. Yeah, let's start with Claude. Break the ice.
So it's very interesting. From a sociology of knowledge, to what extent do you think the ignoring of stillbirths is a little tangled up politically? That is, for the Geneva-based authorities, you start counting stillbirths, start going back, you start to open up the idea that these are quote unquote unborn children, rather than fetuses that become children.
Yeah.
Is that playing a role, do you think?
Yes, I do think so. There's some writing on how abortion has taken over the conversation about pregnancy loss in general, kind of making it very difficult to talk about pregnancy loss. And so, but I think the way that I think about this is, first of all, like the anthropological literature talks a lot about how, personhood sort of begins at various times for various cultures. It's not like a static thing. But also, just thinking about what this research is trying to do, I don't think it's incompatible to say that paying attention to stillbirth and measuring it well is also a way of promoting women's, reproductive justice among, as much as saying that pro-choice sort of stance is also about reproductive justice. But I do think your point is correct that in terms of sociology of knowledge, historically it has been difficult to talk about this because of that issue of like, as soon as you start taking the line back, what prevents you from going back further? But and then from a demographic perspective, you can also think like the entire pregnancy period is important. It is a process of selection. We don't have to sort of get into issues of fetal personhood if we think about it that way. But yes, politically it's potentially quite tricky.
So you're starting at 7 months, and you said to start at different times. But then you also said demography now is acting as devaluing women's experiences, so that I guess my question is, could we think of this as just kind of a trade-off? Should we start 8 days after birth? Should we start 8 days before birth? And there's measurement, and we just have making some compromise. And if that were the framework, how would we choose? I mean, you chose 7 months. I suppose your intellectual grandchildren can say, oh, look, this is devaluing women's experiences. You could have done that 6 months, or you're devaluating religions that start post-birth or whatever. How do you think about kind of good and bad here? What's the kind of objective of choosing what to measure and what not to measure? And I guess even in your talk, you're not saying we should use your measurements. You're saying we should think about considering those measurements. Okay, no argument there. But how do we make a choice of which measures to use in this setup?
I mean, the pregnancy loss one, the TPR, is not actually starting at any point. It's saying let's count all of it. And so I don't think that that's making a choice. My point in talking about the evaluation of women's experiences is more that, like, when we talk about fertility, it's just surprising that we only think about the babies that are born, and there's this whole process of creating those babies that we haven't thought about, and what is the way to count them. I think if we want to think about reproduction, demography is the science about the processes of population, and reproduction is this very obvious thing that we're talking about when we're talking about fertility without actually talking about it. And so I think this is a way of actually quantifying and recognizing that this is an important part of the human process, a part of the reproduction process, a part of what we care about fertility. We've been, I think there is a lot there. It's not that pregnancy loss has not been thought about at all in demography. There are certainly lots of demographers who have thought about fecundity, and pregnancy loss is a part of that process. Like how as women age, how does this change? There's all these questions that have been thought about, but I think the popular measures of TFR, and infant mortality definitely don't recognize any of this. And so that's sort of where this is coming from, is to say, not just like in very niche sort of thinking about fecundity only should we be thinking about this. I think we should be thinking about this more broadly in our more popular measures. And this is just one suggestion of how to get that started. And the TPR, you don't have to make a choice about when to start.
Can I ask a data-related question? When you showed the picture of the so much stillbirth in sub-Saharan Africa, is your understanding that that is mostly measurement issue, or mostly things are reliable enough that we can actually say that there's something qualitatively different going on with pregnancy in sub-Saharan Africa? And if so, what do you think it is?
Sub-Saharan Africa versus other places?
Yeah, your first map,
Uh-huh.
I'm not sure what those estimates were based on, but there was a lot of,
That's a
there was
model
like
estimate,
twice, 2 or 3 times as much stillbirth in sub-Saharan Africa as anywhere else in the world.
Yeah, I do think that that's correct. I don't think, I mean, just being in India, a lot of it is also, you know, there's just a lot of poor obstetric practices. And so that's why so much of it is preventable. Whereas here, when we talk about it, a lot of it is like, there are genetic issues that, you know, are also contributing to stillbirth that are happening in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. But I think part of the reason that it's so prevalent in those places is because you go to a health center, there's no Doppler machine, there's this very easy ways that we could make this better, but we're not counting it, and so it's much harder than to make it better.
Michelle?
Yeah, just following up on this point, I was curious about in your qualitative sample in like India, there seemed to be a particular reticence to talk about or report on solar. So I was just thinking about the DHS measurement and following up on this point, is there differences in reporting? Like with someone in an African country in DHS cross section have higher reports on stillbirth because it's, I don't know, not as fearful to say if you're a woman who had.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely one of the studies that I put up there is from Tanzania, and they're looking specifically at women reporting stillbirths in the DHS. And there, if you have a stillbirth, it is, I think I'm remembering this correctly. The explanation is that you have cheated on your partner. And so it's like, really, you would never say that you have a stillbirth. And so how do you capture? So I think culturally, there's a lot of things that will make it different in each place. So I don't know, but like the modeled rates are coming from lots of different sources. So there's hospital, there's DHS, there's, and so that's why I think those are something we can count on. The DHS is a question, like how much of it is measurement, how much of it is real. Certainly getting better. I think like surveyors are trained to ask better questions and that type of thing, but there's still open questions. Just your time.
We have 2 more questions, Jenna and Nick. I'm sorry, and there was also,
If there's not enough time.
well, there's 3 more questions.
At some point, I'd love to hear your thoughts about measurement innovation in the world without the DHS. So that might be useful to talk about at some point. But I'm just curious about, in the same way that we often at the population level think about fertility distributions, parity distributions, as opposed to this single rate, because stillbirth and pregnancy loss tend to cluster among some people. You can imagine a world where 10% of the population's reproductive labor is underestimated by many factors. I wonder if there's value in doing some distribution work.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I've tried to, the unfortunate part about the stillbirth is that you only have the last 5 years, and so you can't see a lot of losses, but some women do have a lot of losses, you're right. It's worth looking at. Thank you.
Hi, so great. Anyway, I was wondering if besides like a general sense of certain countries being under-resourced, if you're able to look at divergences based on like some things that we know specifically about labor and obstetric complications in different countries. So like, for example, one thing I thought might track with some of this are rates of female circumcision. There's a lot of other things that could potentially be a factor that might be more specific than just a general lack of sort of, doctors, clean conditions, etc. But yeah, if you've been able to look into some of those specifics at all.
I have, so the TPR, sort of the gaps between the TFR and the TPR, I've been trying to understand like what can we understand about the patterns there? And so I haven't thought about female circumcision, but just I've only really looked at the things you said, like, how many doctors per 1,000 people, how many health facilities, female literacy, things like that. But I am not seeing anything that jumps out as like, oh, this could sort of explain what we're seeing. So I'd love to hear more ideas if you have other ones too.
Okay, Nick.
Yeah. So I don't know if I misunderstood, but it seemed like, so you can't tell the difference between stillbirths and abortions. in the data, or is that only for some data?
Stillbirths you can tell because of the length of time she's been pregnant, but
Oh.
miscarriages and abortions because they're not specified as
Okay.
what happens.
So are abortions included in that like your new kind of infant mortality rate that includes infants and the like stuff after 7 months?
No, because in
Okay.
that one it's just stillbirths. So abortion and miscarriage are not included.
Thank you.